Hi, I'm Max Cooper, and welcome to my studio with future music. The Prophet 6 is my most used synth. It's just it's got a nice balance of not doing too much, not trying to do too much, but doing enough to be flexible. But it's just a very well, the parameter space it covers is high proportion, beautiful. I think it's probably the most, like you've got any synth, you've got a bunch of parameters. They have, the continuous values, and then you've got a certain, if you've got 50 parameters, you've got a 50-dimensional space, basically, that has all the capacity, all the sounds that synth can make, all the types of timbres, and obviously you can play different melodies with it, but the different types of timbres it can make. And I think, for me, the Prophet 6 has got the largest proportion of beautiful parameter space. So there's synths that can do just as beautiful things, and a lot more things, but maybe there's parts of that parameter space that I don't really like the sound, and I have to tune them more carefully. The Prophet 6 is just this lovely, it's a lovely crafted thing that just has a lot of beauty in it. So yeah, I use it a lot. The Trigon 6, again, another Dave Smith, RIP, has also become one of my favorites. It's one of the more newer, the newer synths they've come up with, and it's similar level of complexity. It's quite a simple synth, but one that you can jump in and build, and you don't get lost in the complexity. I hate, to be honest, I hate patch diving, and I hate menu diving and shortcuts. The synths that are my favorite ones, like those, there's no digital display. It's just, you can do presets, and it's just like an old school LCD watch sort of display, but there's no menu diving. You don't need shortcuts. Everything's there. You could just jam and play, and you get this real tactile sort of interaction with it. And that's what I look for, to be honest, with hardware synths, and that's why I have all these pedals, again, so I can have real tactile interaction with what I'm doing. But the other synths I use a lot. The Summit is great. So I did a track called, that's a Novation Summit. I did a track called Spike. That was predominantly the Summit. The Summit's like, the Prophets, like if I want, or the Trigon 6 are more, if I want some emotive sort of classic analog sounding things. The Summit's a bit more like, when I have tracks like Vertebrae, which is more like drum and bass track with the gnarly sounds, but if I want something more aggressive, or Spike with this sort of raw type, more digital sounding, I suppose, if that's it's still analog, obviously, but it's a way of explaining what I mean, I think. The Summit's great. It's got a lot of modulation potential. And then, the Juno 6, again, at the end there, again, that's going much further back to like real classic FM synth. And again, I use that. Again, that does even less. That does much less, but what it does amazingly. So again, there's certain tracks. Four-tone Reflections was very predominantly the Juno 6, and it has a very particular sound, and it's really full as well. So that's great when I can use it. Unspoken Words, the track I did actually, that was the Juno 6 running through the Space Echo. So I've got the famous Space Echo hiding in there behind this laptop. So again, that's just Unspoken Words, that piece of music is an ambient piece and very soft, but has a lot of the character from the combination of the Juno and the Space Echo. And then at the end there, the Beast, the Moog 1. So that's obviously the most complex of my analog synths, which I use a lot. To be honest, it's funny. It's the most complex, but actually one of the things I use it for a lot is bass. Just if I want something to cut through, the Moogs often have these really rich, full sounds that cut through really nicely. So I often use it for sounds which are fairly simple. Big bass sounds, for example. If I want it's probably one of my most used bass synths, even though it's actually capable of far more. Transcendental Tree Map was predominantly from the Moog 1. Again, it has a lot of these little blip sounds, like little that cut through the mix really strongly, like sort of rich, sort of classic analog sounding blippy sound. Again, I find the Moog really good for that. And And then above that is the Arturia Polybrute. That one was predominantly used in exotic content. The big aggressive distorted sounds in that are all from the Polybrute. And again, that's got a sort of effects matrix in there, so you can have quite complex routings and unusual sound design. So that's useful as well. But those are my main synths. Well, apart from this little Moog One, my first synth, which I still use loads, which does even less, but what it does amazingly. I use that for bass stabs. A lot of my tracks have got these particular sort of intermittent, rich bass stab noises. It does hardly anything, but what it does is amazing, and I still use it a lot, and that's why it's sat there, right in front of me. And then pedals wise, the Geiger counter, I love distortions. I use a lot of distortions, and a lot of the time quite subtly. The Geiger counter here is one of my favorites for that. It does really intense. It's a wavetable distortion, so it's got tons and tons of different types of distortions, and they're really brutal ones, but that's really handy for basically crackle and fuzz if you want. I often use it really quietly. I don't think it's in this project. I could open other projects to explain this stuff more, but and then distortion wise, this RM1N does a lot of screaming distortion. It's got like amazing feedback. I use that a lot. I often use this distortion on the Moogerfooger pedals. They've got a nice sort of fairly subtle saturation on there, which I run a lot of stuff through. Then you've got the Chase Bliss. There's a couple of Chase Bliss ones which are really nice. This Dark World, which is great for pads, like ethereal pads. Generation Loss is great for that lo-fi, fuzzy effects. And I love this. Again, these are all the ones I use the most. That's why they're sat here. Fairfield Circuitry Meat Mode. It's a delay, but actually I just love the saturation it has. It's really rich, sort of lo-fi saturation. I think one of my tracks, Phi, was one example where it basically the lead in that is basically this. And then, so on top of then there's a delay. There's the Strymon delay here. I've got the tape delay over there, and that's actually a delay as well. On top of that, I mean, then there's the more complex sort of multi-effects pedals, like these hologram, microcosm, and the chroma console, which are, the microcosm does a lot of like sort of staccato, glitchy, lots of constantly varying editing things, and it's really good because you can tap in time and then have something playing. I didn't show this earlier, but this is a lot of the way I work. Is I'll be jamming on a synth, and I might have a little loop I've recorded, or I might just maybe have it on hold, or have a pattern running on an arpeggiator, and then I'll come to the pedals and I'll tap time this synth. I mean, sorry, not this pedal. You can sort of tap it in time with what you're doing, and then it will keep it in time, and you can then change the double time or 4 times time, or quarter or whatever. You can change the interval, and then you can just jam with all these different types of multi effects, and it'll spit out loads of variants, and then you can just let it run and jam with it. And as I showed earlier, I had a little jam, but it's really fun jamming with these multi effects pedals. Also, this Pastel Time is a mad one. It's a sort of tape delay emulation that does a lot of insane glitches. And I mean, the thing about this one is you can assign a modulator, basically an LFO, to any of the parameters, and then you can have, so it'll have individual LFOs for every parameter, and you can then modulate. You just can get wild modulations out of it, basically. So you can get a lot of generative stuff. And that's what I'm looking for with a lot of this stuff, is like, how can I set up a system that has a life of its own, and I can play it, and I can still play my chords and express what I want harmonically, because that's where the sort of emotion is. But then when I play it, it takes on a life of its own and wanders around in these weird ways. That's what I'm always looking for, some sort of system that's partly generative and partly performative. And then I can just bake it, jam, and then go back, edit, and layer, and just start to sequence all of these messes. I often think the way I work is more like a sculptor than a musician. It's like I'm basically chucking a load of stuff, all this, sort of free expression, just chucking, and then I'm like, okay, that's a bad bit, take it away. That's a bad bit, take it away. I'm sort of sculpting away all this stuff I don't want, and in the end, you're left with something. Oh, is this a piece of music that sounds good in the end because you've taken away the bad bits? It's not like you made the good bits so well. It's more about taking away bad bits than it is about making good bits sometimes. Like a sculptor, or at least maybe that's not how sculptors really work, but you see the analogy. So yeah, I think that's the main. I mean, there's other pedals there. Important ones hiding behind here. The Big Sky and the Timeline. The Big Sky in particular, I love the plate reverb on the Big Sky there. That's why it sat right in front of me. Although these screens are in the way because I was working on that new show and having to do this multi-screen stuff. But yeah, and then there's a couple of others there. But yeah, anyway, we don't want to talk about pedals all day, do we? So yeah, I mean, we haven't looked at digital stuff at all, have we? I mean, there's a whole world of like digital processing that happens with this stuff that we just haven't talked about. I mean, you can see here there's an EQ, a saturator, a compressor, multi-band compressor, compressor. Those are side chains, I guess. Another EQ. I'm not that great with compression. I think I'm still, the art of compression is a subtle art, and I do my best with it. I mean, there's the one thing that the most important thing with compression for me is go open the channel on this view in Ableton if you use Ableton. Let's just see if I can set that. So turn on and off your compressor and check the level. And make sure when you turn the compressor on, because it's very easy to stick a compressor on and it basically sounds great, and all you've done is turned it up. Because you basically want to see that the level is still the same on the output, but it sounds louder. So what you're aiming for, the basic thing is like, when I turn the compressor on, I want the level to be the same, and I want it to sound louder or better. It doesn't have to be louder, just sound better. Because it's very easy to just like trick yourself into, because essentially if all you're doing is turning things up, then you're not actually, that you don't gain anything by using that sort of compression. You need to you want to tame things and have the levels stay down so that when it comes to the final mix, you've got headroom to mix everything rather than everything's always peaking really loud. Then you have to limit loads on the master, and that's another thing. I try to limit as little as possible on the master. Oh, this is going to get really loud. Actually, this has not been limited. Whoa. I'm not sure. Hopefully. Yeah, I try to. That's actually more limiting than I would usually use. That's about right. I try to aim for the master limiter to have maybe -3, -5 dB or something like that, not bouncing too much. I find the best mixes are whenever everything's naturally quite balanced before it gets to the master channel. So I'm not like trying to squash the shit out of everything on the master bus and like fix the mix there. The mix has to be fixed in the the sub mix buses, for example, and the overall mix balance. And I generally try to go quite light on compression. I've done quite a lot of tracks in the past where there's not that much compression at all, even in the earlier phases. But as I'm learning more about compression, I'm getting a bit more comfortable to push harder on that front. The other key thing for loudness and getting things coherent is saturation. I use tons of these saturators, like the Ableton's basic saturators. The soft sign, actually, just here we go, just the soft sign, and I think saturators tend to they do have a sort of compression effect anyway. They will make things, by increasing the overtones, the amplitude of the overtones is increased basically on the sounds, and it makes everything louder. So actually you get a bit of a compression type effect where everything's made louder without the level going way up. So saturation is as important as compression in terms of me getting my mixes right, in terms of getting the fullness out of them. And then EQing. This is an old track, so this was from before I was using FabFilter Pro Q3, which people can't believe I used to make music without Pro Q3 because everyone seems to use it loads. But that's another really important part of the process of taming these sounds is, particularly when they're strange sounds, they'll have really weird aberrant frequencies. And Pro Q3 is great for that in terms of basically going in and if there's something you don't like the sound of, setting a dynamic EQ so that you can basically pull out a certain frequency band that sounds nasty, for example, but not all the time, only pulling it out whenever it peaks. So you can choose how much you pull out. I use that a lot for taming sounds which have got nasty frequencies in, and of course, like high passing and low passing things whenever over here, isn't it? If being careful if I don't need the bass, or basically high passing nearly everything apart from things where the bass lines and the bass is definitely in there. Being really careful with the bass, the lows, that is always one of the most important things in electronic music. You can get away with quite a lot of chaos in the higher frequency realms, but in the lows you have to be super careful about keeping it simple, making sure the kick comes through clearly, and the side chaining issues, and making sure the bass is not competing with the kick, and making sure you're hitting the right sorts of frequencies as well. So depending on what sort of music you want to make, that can vary a bit. But for me, generally, I usually have my kicks around 50 hertz ish, and then I'll usually want my bass to have some, I usually use a lot of bass harmonies. I want to have something in there, usually 40 to 60, 40, 60, 70, fairly low, and then something a bit more subtle down at 30 or 40. But it's difficult mixing that stuff. I use this thing's been really handy, this sub pack. That basically does a tactile low frequency, so you can get it shakes you with the low frequency, so you can actually hear down to 30, 20 hertz nicely with that, which is great for mixing, sort of emulating a club. And obviously I've got these big ass speakers now, but I didn't work with them for years and years. I was much more reliant on this for, trying to simulate what it would be like in a big club system. But now, these Genelec subs are really nice now for actually doing that with the audio, with the sort of regular audio as well. But that sub pack has always been really helpful. Yeah, because usually the shows I do are purely electronic, apart from the odd recording of a Sansula or a vocalist and that sort of thing. But this was a project where I was commissioned to do somewhat classical and opera electronic crossover from a festival in Austria, Salzburg festival. It's a big classical and opera festival, and they had their theme of Italian opera and Italian classical, and they wanted some sort of electronic interpretation of that. So that was the challenge. So they wanted me to work with an opera singer, which we did, which is amazing, with Kim Sheehan in Barbican in London and Sarah Aristidou in Salzburg. And I wanted to also work with Tom Hodge, the pianist, and Niels Arends, the cellist, and also he plays modular synth as well. So yeah, it was. I think the process for actually writing the music was pretty smooth, because I've done plenty of projects before with Tom and with Niels, and I've done a lot of projects before with live musicians. It was the bigger challenge was actually the performance, because just the simple things like feedbacks, which as an electronic musician, anyone that's in a band will be well versed on this. That's when they do their setup and they tune everything and put your EQs and your multi-band limiters in and what you need to sort of catch any stray frequencies and resonances. But that was just an additional, something that I wasn't used to dealing with. But we dealt with it. There was a few challenges. But no, I think in terms of the main challenge wasn't working with all the musicians were amazing. They're all brilliant people and brilliant musicians, so it was pretty smooth and a very enjoyable process working with them. I think the main challenge was just trying to build a new show, and I did incorporate lots of old projects. I gave it that seed title, seed in Seme in Italian, meaning seed, so that I could link in a lot of my, like this one, Cellular Automata is like sort of foundational idea in the sciences, I suppose. So I linked in lots of seed ideas from sciences, as well as sort of Italian seeds, like historic music and historic, the Fibonacci sequence, historic science, and I tried to apply that seed idea across the board, and I was able to link in old projects of mine as well. But the biggest challenge was just how to build a whole new show around this idea, because there was lots of new content. And then working with Architecture Social Club, that was probably where most of the work went in, was actually working with the guys who were in charge of, they were building touch designer systems to sync laser to the visual system. So actually what we've been looking at today was only part of the system. That's for the projectors and the visuals, but there was a whole other layer of multiple bits of software running for lasers and lights, which would then, the idea being that when I'm doing this 3D visual on multiple layers, the laser aligns with the visual to sort of extrude it. So you get the image going, there's a sort of Z-axis depth going back because you've got the multiple screen layers, but then there's also a depth coming forward from the laser, highlighting, edge detecting or highlighting parts of the image and extruding them back over the audience. So it was a sort of double, basically trying to extend the capacity of this 3D AV show, and how do we make it more 3D, more immersive? How do we, I always want the audience to feel like they're in the middle of this sort of abstract entity, that's growing around them, and that's why I project on all the walls and try and use as much of the space as possible. But it's the same process musically as well with all the spatial audio. Why we've got the speakers here, it's the same. How do you basically make people feel like they're living inside this thing, so that you can really story tell with a lot more intensity, and you can do subtle things in a lot more powerful way as well. It doesn't, when you're most venues with a couple of speakers, you have to be so brash to sort of really get people. Whereas when you have a really much more immersive system, you can let the music really be calmer, and you can immerse people in different ways, and you can storytell in ways that you can't do otherwise. So that's part of the reason I love using these sorts of systems, whether it's visuals or for the music. There's an insane amount of, every week, or there's a barrage of amazing tools that I don't have enough time to play with. There's no shortage of exciting tools, definitely on the software front, which we haven't really delved into the software at all. But the Max for Live, the community of people making Max for Live tools and contact tools. I mean, one that I used recently, which was really exciting, was the Void and Vista. What's the name of it? I'll just open up so we can look. I'll show you it. It's really cool. But yeah, this is a really interesting new device that I've had a little play around with, which you can basically play voices and you get the idea. You can do really beautiful, weird, textural voice jams. That was a nice new discovery recently. But apart from that, I guess the other things that have excited me musically recently in terms of the tech, this is my most recent pedal, which I love, the hologram chroma console. It's just, again, it's like lots of modulation potential. You basically got banks of different effects. So there's 4 banks, and then it processes the sound, bank by bank, and you can have different combinations of effects. So you can have a drive or fuzz or whatever, howl, swell on the first one, and you can choose which one, and the parameter settings, and then you can have a movement. So you have vibrato and phaser and tremolo and pitch modulation, and then you can have these sort of cascade, real sort of granular type effects and things, and then final, almost like a effects chain in a bus, and then it's the mix, and you can squash it all, and so you can do a bunch of things and hands-on modulate, play around with everything while you're running the audio, which is the main reason I have these effects, because most of this stuff you can do digitally as well, but for me it just makes a massive difference having the hands-on interaction, so that when I'm working on a piece of music, I can generate movement and expression from what could otherwise be quite a dry sound, because I can get hands-on control of lots of parameters. Ableton, there's a new Ableton as well, which is obviously exciting, which I haven't tried yet, which I've downloaded, but I'm in the middle of an album and I didn't want to start the new Ableton in the middle of an album. I was like, let's just get it finished and then I'll look at that. I mean, my Juno 6 was built in 1970 or something, and I'm still using it now. So I think there's always classic. It's interesting. You would imagine that by now any classic synthesizer could be emulated digitally, but they still can't, which is interesting. And that the tape echo, like people, they sell, they're valuable things because it's really hard to emulate what these old synthesizers and effects processing units do digitally. So I think there will still be a place for that, because we still all have our reference points of these old, bands, and that sound from certain eras is sunk into our culture and into our psyche and into our subconscious, and we can't escape it. So we still, when we hear something that reminds us subconsciously of some record from 1973 or whatever, and it has that fuzzy, this lo-fi, we sort of connect that with quality. So all these old devices have a life because that's embedded in our culture, that our appreciation of these, essentially the old techniques and machines. So for me, it's about, I love having these old machines and techniques, but then also having the new, the spectral stuff or the AI stuff or whatever it is, all the new techniques, and getting the, combining it all together. So you've got the old reference points and the new, and you've got this fusion of ideas. That's what I aim for. But what's going to happen next? Obviously, yeah, I mean, the AI thing is the obvious thing that's only still in its infancy musically. It's a lot more developed in the visual realms. But text to music systems will explode, I'm sure. And things like Synplant 2 is great, which I've been using already, which has got an AI system in there for you can drop any sound in and it'll sort of try and figure out how to drive the internal synthesizer to recreate the sound you're dropping in. And that's a really nice way of sort of directing it to new types of sound design, using an AI system, but still having sort of musical control. Because the issue with this stuff is, if you give too much of the creative process to the AI system, then it doesn't leave a lot of room for humans to do their stuff, and that's not, it's not much fun. If you're trying to express yourself, then that's not that much fun. So it's about getting the balance. But I also mentioned that I use all of these systems I love partly generative systems. I love being able to play something that also has a life of its own. And AI will open, what I'm waiting for, what I want from AI systems is, for example, really unusual timbral, a synth that I can play, but has timbral qualities that no other synth can, because you don't need to use an FM synthesis engine or a subtractive synth. Then you don't have to use the traditional techniques, so you should be able to access, and you can access timbres and worlds of sound that you can't otherwise. And that's where it's exciting for me, is having something new that can still be played like a traditional instrument, so you can still express what you want, but the AI is coming in to help build on what you're doing already, rather than just saying, let's replicate something that humans already do. That's where it's not exciting. That's where, but I'm sure that's still going to explode, because it's going to be useful. Because if you don't want to spend 20 years, obsessing over, how to do the things, you can just type in, do it like this, and it'll give you that sound and that approach. But it will always be limiting in terms of, if you give too much to the system, how it'll be limiting in terms of, how do I do this in my own way? Because of that's where it's helpful to be able to, like I was talking about earlier, delving into the percussion and saying, no, I'm not going to use drum synths. I'm going to use all my own sounds. And if you're using, having that micro scale control, if you do lots of those micro choices, you can then build into something which sounds different to everyone else. And I guess that's where it can become difficult if we're in future more heavily reliant on AI systems, is how do we make them sound different from everyone else? And I guess that could be to do with prompting, but also I'm sure it'll come down to people coding and there's people like Rob Clouth, for example, who builds. He's an amazing musician, but also an amazing software developer. He builds some AI systems, lots of other all sorts, but he uses programming and technology in a really creative way from the ground up. And I think that's probably the future of a lot of the arts, is that a lot of artists will be mathematicians and coders and people that are really delving into the nuts and bolts and using the technology in a creative way from the ground up. Try and make it as much fun as possible, I suppose. You have to be emotionally engaged with the process and what you're doing, so that to give you that obsessive, not wanting to leave the piece of music, to keep going, and to then make a shit piece of music and then keep going again, because it's so the music industry is so competitive, and it's so difficult to like make any money off music or get anyone to listen to it, or do you know what I mean? It's really difficult, the whole process. And I feel like however far you go, it doesn't stop. You have to keep on pushing and working hard, and it has to be enjoyable. So I think that's the primary thing, is that you've got to find something that you love, and if you're lucky, then some other people will like it as well. And if you're unlucky, you'll love something that no one else likes. And that's what, a lot of people I know like that. They make these amazing things, but it's just not accessible. But if that's your lot, then that's sort of what you've got. I think you've got to, the music industry is so fast changing and can be fickle and whatever. I think you've got to be doing it for your own reasons, as opposed to like trying to please everyone else, or because in the end it's you that's going to have to sit there for years and years working on it.